All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good buddy Greg Kaufmann. Greg is the writer of This Week in Poverty for The Nation magazine, which focuses on the plight of the poor. You can find it at thenation.com. You can also follow Greg on Twitter at Greg Kaufmann. Greg, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Always enjoy talking with you, Matt.
All right, so Greg, you recently had a really, really amazing column, and I really like the framing of this, talking about the SNAP crisis, actually calling what DC is doing right now congressional Hunger Games, because it literally is Hunger Games. I mean, we're literally dealing with people who are starving and dealing with food. So tell us all about it.
Yeah, I mean, I call it Hunger Games because, in large part, because when Congress, both parties, talk about SNAP, which is the name of the food stamps program now, or talk about hunger, they aren't dealing in truth and facts, and they are playing games with people's well-being when they do these cuts. So what I mean by that is, let's start even with the Democrats. They, led by the Democrats, the Senate voted to cut $4 billion in SNAP spending over 10 years. And Senator Debbie Stabenow, a Democrat from Michigan, who chairs the Agriculture Committee, said, well, this is just waste, fraud, and abuse. And no, it's not, because what it is 500,000 families would lose $90 a month, which is like a week of assistance. And it's important for our listeners to understand that people are only receiving on average $4.50 a day, $4.50 for a person. So it's a big deal. If she had, it's not like she was taking a scalpel to the program to find waste, what she called waste, fraud, and abuse. And by the way, less than 1 cent on the dollar is lost to fraud in terms of SNAP spending. I mean, can you imagine if our defense contractors have that rate? You know, it would be great. So that's one example of games. Now, House Republicans, much more extreme. I mean, first they tried to cut $20 billion over 10 years, and they couldn't because they couldn't pass it because Republicans wanted deeper cuts. But that would have kicked 2 million people off of SNAP, and 210,000 children would have lost access to free meals, free school meals. So now they talked about everything in their Hunger Games. I mean, they talked about fraud, which I just spoke to. They talked about the deficit. They said it was going to cut the deficit. Well, you know what? Congressional Budget Office says that SNAP spending is only going to be 1.7% of total federal spending over the next 10 years. So it has absolutely nothing to do with the deficit. They talked about people were too dependent. Well, I just mentioned, Matt, would you like to learn how to get by on $4.50 a day? I mean, nobody's dependent. Everybody needs more than that. And in fact, there was a study by Hillary Hoynes out at UC Davis that showed women who received SNAP when they were young or in utero, okay, they actually had less reliance on, less need for welfare assistance when they were older. And she compared it county by county, people who had access to food stamps when the program was rolled out, compared to people who didn't. So it was a pretty incredible study. But, so the point is, studies and facts have nothing to do with what Congress is talking about with regard to food stamps at a time when 50 million Americans, are dealing with food insecurity, which means they don't know where their next meal is necessarily coming from. So that's why I call it Hunger Games, and it would be great if, we could deal in a world of fact and evidence instead of this nonsense.
Yeah, it really goes to show how, and again, we've talked about this before, how horrible the kind of paradigm has shifted so far to the right that you have the Democrats. I mean, again, Republicans are worse. I mean, on a certain level, they're trying to cut more, but right. You actually have Democrats in the Senate, again, and we're not even talking about, oh, look, we found that this specific aspect of this specific program has redundancies. This specific aspect has something that could be, done a little bit smarter, a little bit better to help save a little bit of money. It's not that. It's not like, oh, hey, we have found this specific thing that is fraudulent that we can fix by changing changing this. And by doing that, we're going to save some money. That's not what the Democrats in the Senate did. No, they said, no, let's just cut $4 billion because of fraud. See, we just call it fraud, even though, again, 1 cent on the dollar, like you said, is actually lost to fraud. And just the fact that we have Democrats who have shifted so far to the right, that's acceptable is really, really awful.
It's pretty disheartening. And let me just be clear. I mean, what they tried to do was those $4 billion in cuts would come from is something called the Heat and Eat program, which is people who already qualify for SNAP, but who also qualify for utility assistance. So they're paying a disproportionate amount of their income towards utilities. It's basically cold weather states. Would get, I believe, an extra $90. So and governors have to opt in for that program. And the idea was, states don't have the capacity to be reviewing everybody's utility bills month by month by month to see how much of their total income they're spending. So they gave a little a benefit for those people. Now, if Senator Stabenow and others say, no, that's not the best way to figure out those benefits, that's fine. But by calling it waste, fraud, and abuse, it's just absurd because these are, as I said, already people who are qualifying for SNAP assistance. So you're right. It's not a scalpel, and it's certainly not the right label for what they're trying to do: waste, fraud, and abuse. And the other thing is, I understand in Washington, you need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything through, unfortunately, still. So I understand if in the end maybe they did have to end up in a place where they offered some kind of cut. I don't know. But the point is they didn't rally to fight for the right thing in the beginning and say, this is vital assistance to Americans struggling with hunger. This is a program that works. We have studies that show, we intuitively know, you and I, Matt, and anyone else, that $4.50 a day isn't enough in assistance. But, the Institute of Medicine did a study showing that the whole basis for the assumption of the benefit is flawed. It's just kind of obsolete. They're assuming that people have access to fresh fruits and vegetables and they're going to cook their meals from scratch. There's two problems right there. Most low-wage workers working non-traditional hours aren't going to have that kind of time, and tons of people in urban and rural areas don't even have access to those kinds of fresh fruits and vegetables and ingredients. So, these are the kinds of conversations that Democrats should have been having, and they just, and you're right, it's just been this shift to the right and sort of some spinelessness and wimpiness on the part of most Democrats. There are some exceptions. Senator Gillibrand tried to restore that cut through an amendment. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. A lot of good representatives in the House: Barbara Lee, Jim McGovern, my non-voting representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton from the district. John Conyers. There are a lot of people who are trying to step up and do the right thing, but we need a lot more of it. And we also need to hear from people who are experiencing hunger in SNAP, who are experiencing hunger and know the SNAP program because it helps them. I would love to hear these House Republicans have to tell a witness to her face who's using SNAP, you are lazy because you're working 2 jobs trying to arrange childcare and need $4.50 in assistance a day. We need to bring low-income people into the conversation, into Congress, and give them a chance to tell their stories.